Welcome back to History for Sleep, where we drift through the deep past one story at a time. Tonight we're going on a slow, soothing journey into one of the most profound transformations in human history. A time when ice ruled the earth for 100,000 years, and in that frozen crucible, something extraordinary happened. The cold didn't destroy us. It created us. It shaped our minds, our bodies, our very souls into what we recognize today as modern humans. How did a world locked in ice forge the spark of human consciousness that burns within you right now as you listen to these words? As always, I hope this video helps you drift off gently, or at least helps you put your worries into perspective by zooming out a few 100,000 years. Of course, there's a small risk that it might be too interesting and keep you awake. But if that happens, well, at least you'll have learned something fascinating along the way. Before we float off into the past together, I'd love it if you gave this video a like and maybe even subscribed if you haven't already. It really helps this sleepy little channel grow. I'd also love to know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. It's always such a joy to see our sleepy history community scattered gently across the globe. Now, settle in. Get comfortable. You don't need to remember any of this. You don't need to take notes or stay alert. Just let the words wash over you like whispers on the wind. And as we begin this gentle voyage into the vast unknown, remember this video is for educational and relaxation purposes only and is not intended as medical advice. Ready? Let's begin. Picture this. 130,000 years ago, the world was warm. Warmer than it is today. The great ice sheets that we know from maps of Greenland and Antarctica were smaller, tucked away in their polar corners like sleeping giants. Sea levels were higher, and the coastlines you might recognize today were drowned beneath gentle, warm waters. This was the Eemian interglacial period, a time of abundance and growth that stretched across the planet like a long, peaceful summer afternoon. In what we now call Europe, hippos wallowed in rivers that flow through modern-day London. Yes, hippos. These massive creatures, which we associate with the hot rivers of Africa, were perfectly at home in the Thames Valley. Lions prowled through forests where German cities now stand. Straight-tusked elephants, magnificent creatures standing 4 meters tall at the shoulder, wandered through deciduous forests that stretched from the Atlantic coast deep into the heart of the continent. The world was a garden, lush and wild and free. In Africa, our ancestral homeland, the Sahara, was not the vast desert we know today. Instead, it was a patchwork of grasslands and lakes, crisscrossed by rivers that have long since vanished into memory. Crocodiles basked on the shores of lakes that existed where now there is only sand. Ancient humans, our direct ancestors, lived in small bands across this verdant landscape. They were not yet what we would call modern humans, though they looked much like us. Their brains were large, their bodies were graceful and strong, but something was different. The spark of symbolic thought, of art and complex language that defines our species, had not yet fully ignited. They made tools, certainly. They hunted and gathered with skill. They cared for their sick and elderly. They buried their dead with what might have been the first glimmers of ritual. But the explosion of creativity that would later paint cave walls and carve figurines from ivory had not yet begun. These early humans lived in a world of plenty. The warm climate meant that food was abundant year-round. Fruits ripened on trees in endless succession. Herds of animals moved in predictable patterns across the landscape. Rivers ran full and clear. The need for complex planning, for storing food for lean times, for developing intricate social structures to survive harsh conditions, simply didn't exist in the same way it would soon be forced upon them. Life was not easy, of course. Predators stalked the night. Diseases claimed lives. Accidents happened. But compared to what was coming, this was a time of relative comfort and stability. The Earth itself seemed settled in this warm embrace. For 10,000 years the climate had been stable. Generations upon generations of humans had been born, lived and died in this consistent world. The patterns of the seasons were reliable. The rains came when they were supposed to come. The herds migrated along ancient paths worn by countless hooves over countless years. If you had been alive then, if you could have asked an elder about the world, they would have told you stories passed down through hundreds of generations, all describing essentially the same world. A warm world, a green world, a world that seemed as eternal and unchanging as the stars above. But deep beneath this peaceful surface, forces were stirring that would transform everything. The Earth's orbit around the Sun is not a perfect circle. It stretches and contracts over vast cycles lasting tens of thousands of years. The tilt of our planet's axis wobbles like a spinning top, slowly, imperceptibly, but with profound consequences. The way the Earth's axis points relative to its orbit shifts over time, changing which hemisphere receives more direct sunlight during different seasons. These cycles, discovered by a Serbian mathematician named Milankovitch in the early 20th century, are the hidden clockwork that drives the ice ages. And 130,000 years ago, these cosmic gears were beginning to shift. The changes were so subtle that no human alive could have noticed them. Each summer was perhaps a fraction of a degree cooler than the last. Each winter lasted perhaps a day longer. These differences were lost in the natural variation of weather from year to year. But in the high Arctic, where summer temperatures hover right at the edge of freezing, these tiny changes had enormous consequences. Snow that had always melted by midsummer began to linger a little longer. Each year, a thin layer of last winter's snow survived through the summer, compressed by its own weight into ice. Year after year, layer upon layer, the ice began to build. It's important to understand that ice ages don't arrive suddenly like a blizzard. They creep in over millennia, so slowly that hundreds of generations can live and die, without realizing that their world is fundamentally changing. The first humans to experience the cooling might have noticed that their grandparents' stories about the weather didn't quite match their own experiences. Perhaps the berries that once grew abundantly in certain valleys became harder to find. Perhaps the herds began to shift their migration routes slightly. But these changes were so gradual that they could easily be dismissed as natural variation, as the kind of changes that have always happened and always will. In the far north, beyond where any humans ventured, the great ice sheets were beginning their work. Like living things, they grew, feeding on the snow that fell each winter. The white surface of the ice reflected sunlight back into space, cooling the local area and encouraging more snow to fall. This created what scientists call a positive feedback loop. More ice meant cooler temperatures, which meant more snow, which meant more ice. The process, once started, was self-reinforcing and almost impossible to stop. The ice sheets of Scandinavia began to merge with those of Scotland. The Laurentide ice sheet in North America started its slow march south from the Hudson Bay. These were not glaciers as we might imagine them today, rivers of ice flowing down mountain valleys. These were continental ice sheets, vast domes of ice that could be 3 kilometers thick at their center, pressing down on the Earth's crust with such weight that the very bedrock began to sink. As the ice grew, it began to affect the entire planet's climate system. The jet streams, those high-altitude rivers of air that guide weather patterns, were pushed south by the expanding cold. The monsoons that brought life-giving rain to vast areas of Africa and Asia began to weaken and shift. The tropical rainforests, those great engines of biodiversity, began to shrink and fragment. The warm, shallow seas that had been nurseries for countless species began to cool and empty. The chemistry of the oceans themselves began to change as cold, dense water sank at the poles and began to alter the great conveyor belts of ocean currents that distribute heat around the globe. For the humans living in Africa, the changes were felt first as a drying. The regular rains became less predictable. Rivers that had always run began to flow only seasonally, then dried up entirely. The Great Lakes of the Sahara region began to shrink. What had been grassland began to turn to scrub, and scrub to desert. The abundant game animals that had been the foundation of human survival began to disappear or migrate to distant regions. The fruit trees produced less fruit. The edible plants became harder to find. This wasn't a sudden catastrophe, but a slow tightening of the noose, generation by generation, forcing humans to adapt or die. And adapt they did, though the cost was terrible. Archaeological evidence from this period shows a dramatic decline in human populations. Sites that had been continuously occupied for thousands of years were abandoned. The genetic evidence is even more stark. By analysing the DNA of modern humans, scientists have discovered that all humans alive today are descended from a remarkably small population that lived during this period. The technical term is a population bottleneck, but what it really means is that humanity came terrifyingly close to extinction. Some estimates suggest that the effective breeding population of humans may have dropped to as few as 10,000 individuals, perhaps even fewer. To put that in perspective, there are more gorillas alive today than there were humans during the worst of the Ice Age. This near extinction wasn't caused by a single catastrophic event, like an asteroid impact or a supervolcanic eruption. It was a slow-motion disaster that played out over thousands of years. As the ice advanced and the climate deteriorated, human populations became isolated from each other. Groups that had once traded and intermarried were separated by expanding deserts or advancing ice. Small bands of humans found themselves trapped in shrinking patches of habitable land, islands of life in an increasingly hostile world. Many of these isolated populations simply died out, their genetic lineages lost forever. The groups that survived were the ones that found refugia, special places where the local geography or climate provided some protection from the worst of the Ice Age conditions. These refugia were not paradises. They were merely places where survival was possible, though still desperately difficult. Along the southern coast of Africa, where the warm Agulhas current kept temperatures relatively mild, small bands of humans clung to existence. They learned to exploit marine resources, gathering shellfish from tidal pools, hunting seals, perhaps even fishing from primitive boats. The archaeological sites from this period, places like Pinnacle Point and Blombos Cave, show evidence of a people under extreme stress, but responding with remarkable innovation. They developed new tool-making techniques, creating sophisticated stone blades and points. They began to use ochre, a red pigment, for purposes we can only guess at. Was it for decoration, for ritual, for practical purposes like tanning, hides or protecting skin from the sun? We don't know, but we know they valued it enough to collect it and process it and carry it with them. In East Africa, the Great Rift Valley provided another refugium. This massive geological feature, stretching from the Red Sea to Mozambique, created a variety of microclimates and ecological niches. Even as the surrounding areas dried out, there were places in the Rift Valley where springs still flowed and edible plants still grew. The varied topography meant that humans could move up and down in elevation to follow the changing zones of vegetation as the climate shifted. The lakes of the Rift Valley, though shrinking, still provided water and attracted game animals. It was a hard life, but it was life nonetheless. The humans who survived in these refugia were not the same as their ancestors who had lived through the warm Eemian period. The harsh conditions of the Ice Age were selecting for different traits. Physical strength and endurance were obviously important, but perhaps even more crucial were intelligence and social cooperation. The humans who survived were the ones who could plan ahead, who could remember where resources could be found in different seasons, who could innovate when traditional strategies failed. They were the ones who could work together, sharing food in times of scarcity, caring for the sick and injured, passing on knowledge to the next generation. The Ice Age was not just changing the human body, it was shaping the human mind. This cognitive evolution wasn't happening in a vacuum. As human populations shrank and became isolated, each group was forced to solve the problems of survival in their own way. Some groups developed better hunting techniques. Others became expert at finding and processing plant foods. Some learned to exploit coastal resources. Others developed ways to survive in increasingly arid inland areas. This diversity of survival strategies, born of isolation and necessity, would become one of humanity's greatest strengths. When populations eventually reconnected as the Ice Age waned, they would share these innovations, creating a toolkit of survival strategies that would enable humans to colonize every continent except Antarctica. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, in this first phase of the Ice Age, survival itself was an achievement. Each day that a human group managed to find enough food, each child that survived to adulthood, each piece of knowledge successfully passed to the next generation was a small victory against the overwhelming forces of climate and extinction. These early Ice Age humans couldn't have known that they were the ancestors of everyone alive today. They couldn't have imagined that their struggle for survival in a cooling world was forging the characteristics that would one day allow their descendants to build cities, compose symphonies, and travel to the moon. They were simply trying to make it through another day, another season, another year in a world that was becoming increasingly hostile to human life. The archaeological record from this period is sparse, which itself tells a story. Fewer humans meant fewer artifacts left behind. The sites that do exist often show evidence of repeated occupation over long periods, suggesting that humans had found a few precious places where survival was possible and clung to them desperately. These sites often contain the bones of a wide variety of animals, from large game to small rodents to shellfish, indicating that humans were becoming less selective in their diet, eating whatever they could find. The tool assemblages become more varied and sophisticated, suggesting that humans were developing specialized tools for different tasks. But perhaps most intriguingly, we begin to see the first unambiguous evidence of symbolic behavior. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, archaeologists have found pieces of ochre engraved with geometric patterns dating to around 100,000 years ago. These patterns, crosshatches, and parallel lines are deliberate and careful. They serve no obvious practical purpose. They are, in essence, art, or at least the precursor to art. They represent a mind that could conceive of abstract patterns, could impose meaning on the material world, could create something for reasons beyond mere survival. This is a profound development in human cognition. It suggests that even in the depths of the Ice Age, even when survival was desperately uncertain, humans were beginning to develop the capacity for symbolic thought that would eventually produce language, art, religion, and all the other characteristics we associate with modern human behavior. The engraved ochre from Blombos Cave is not an isolated find. From the same period, we have evidence of shell beads, carefully perforated and presumably strung together as jewellery. We have evidence of adhesives made from complex recipes involving ochre, plant gums, and other materials used to attach stone points to wooden shafts. We have evidence of heat treatment of stones to improve their flaking properties, a sophisticated technique that requires careful control of temperature and timing. All of these innovations suggest minds that were not just reactive, but creative, not just solving immediate problems, but experimenting and innovating. This cognitive flowering in the midst of environmental catastrophe is one of the great paradoxes of human evolution. It seems counterintuitive that human intelligence and creativity would develop most rapidly during a period of extreme hardship. We might expect that when survival is difficult, all energy would be devoted to finding food and avoiding predators, with no time or energy left for art or innovation. But perhaps it was precisely because survival was so difficult that innovation became necessary. when the old ways of doing things no longer worked, when the game animals disappeared and the plants no longer grew, where they used to, humans had no choice but to think of new solutions. Necessity, as the saying goes, is the mother of invention. There's another factor to consider as well. The small population sizes during the Ice Age bottleneck may have actually accelerated human evolution, both biological and cultural. In a large population, new mutations and new ideas can get diluted and lost. But in a small population, a beneficial mutation or a useful innovation can quickly spread through the entire group. If a single individual figured out a better way to make tools or discovered a new food source, that knowledge could transform the survival prospects of the entire band. Similarly, if a genetic mutation made someone slightly better at digesting certain foods or resisting certain diseases, that advantage could quickly become common in the population through natural selection. This is not to romanticize the hardship of the Ice Age. For every group that survived and innovated, many others perished. For every child who grew to adulthood and passed on their genes and knowledge, many others died in infancy. The Ice Age was a filter, and it was merciless. But those who passed through it were changed by the experience. They were more intelligent, more cooperative, more innovative than their ancestors. They had been forced to develop new ways of thinking and new ways of being human. The Ice Age was creating modern humans, one desperate generation at a time. As we move deeper into the Ice Age, the situation becomes even more extreme. By 90,000 years ago, the ice sheets covered much of northern Europe and North America. Sea levels had dropped by over 100 meters as water was locked up in ice. What had been coastal plains were now exposed sea floor, creating land bridges between regions previously separated by water. But these new lands were often barren, swept by cold, dry winds and supporting little life. The tropical forests had retreated to small pockets near the equator. The great grasslands of Africa had largely turned to desert. The human population, already small, continued to decline. It was during this period, the depths of the Ice Age, that we see some of the most remarkable human achievements. At sites in South Africa, we find evidence of complex composite tools, items made from multiple parts that had to be assembled in a specific way. We find evidence of long-distance transport of materials, suggesting the trade networks or seasonal movements over vast distances. We find evidence of systematic exploitation of marine resources, including deep-water fish that could only have been caught with boats or sophisticated fishing equipment. These were not the behaviours of desperate, starving people barely clinging to existence. These were the behaviours of intelligent, planning, innovative people who were mastering their environment despite its hostility. The cognitive abilities required for these behaviours are substantial. Making a composite tool requires not just knowing how to shape stone and wood, but understanding how different materials interact, how to create adhesives that will hold under stress, how to design a tool where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Transporting materials over long distances requires memory of distant places, planning for future needs, and possibly negotiation with other groups. Exploiting marine resources requires understanding of tides, seasonal movements of fish, and possibly the construction and navigation of watercraft. These are not instinctive behaviours. They are learned, culturally transmitted, complex behavioural packages that require significant cognitive capacity to master and pass on. But perhaps the most remarkable evidence from this period is the beginning of what we might call modern human culture. At sites across Africa, we find evidence of regional variations in tool-making styles. Groups separated by relatively small distances were making tools in distinctly different ways, not because one way was objectively better, but because each group had developed its own traditions, its own way of doing things. This is culture in the anthropological sense, learned behaviour that varies between groups and is transmitted from generation to generation. It's the beginning of the incredible cultural diversity that characterises our species today. We also see the first evidence of what might be called ethnic markers, ways that groups distinguish themselves from others. The shell beads found at various sites are made from different species of shells and are perforated in different ways. The ochre used for decoration comes from different sources and is processed differently. These differences seem to be intentional, ways that groups signal their identity, their belonging to a particular community. In a world where human groups were small and scattered, where encountering another band of humans was a rare and potentially dangerous event, being able to quickly identify whether someone was part of your extended community or a stranger would have been crucial. This development of group identity and cultural markers might seem like a small thing, but it represents a fundamental shift in human cognition and social organization. It means that humans were thinking not just about their immediate family or band, but about larger communities united by shared culture rather than just kinship. It means that humans were capable of abstract thought about group membership and identity. It means that humans were beginning to create the complex social structures that would eventually enable them to cooperate in groups of hundreds, thousands, eventually millions of individuals. The Ice Age was not just changing human bodies and minds, it was changing human society. The harsh conditions made cooperation essential. A single individual or even a single family could not survive alone. It took a band working together to hunt large game, to defend against predators, to care for children and elderly, to maintain the cultural knowledge necessary for survival. But more than that, it took connections between bands. When a local resource failed, when game disappeared or water sources dried up, having relationships with other groups, knowing where they were and being able to join them or trade with them, could mean the difference between survival and extinction. These social networks, invisible in the archaeological record but essential for survival, were another crucial development of the Ice Age period. Humans were learning to maintain relationships across distance and time. They were developing systems of reciprocity and obligation. They were creating the social technologies that would eventually enable large-scale cooperation. The foundation of human civilization was being laid, not in cities or farms, but in the desperate cooperation of small bands of humans trying to survive in a frozen world. As we contemplate this period, it's worth remembering that these were real people, as human as you or I, facing challenges we can barely imagine. They felt cold and hunger and fear. They loved their children and mourned their dead. They told stories around fires and sang songs we'll never hear. They looked up at the same stars we see and wondered about their place in the universe. They were not primitives or savages. They were our ancestors, and they were magnificent. Every one of us alive today carries their legacy in our genes and in our minds. The intelligence that allows you to understand these words, the creativity that enables art and music, the social instincts that make us care for others and work together, all of these were forged in the crucible of the Ice Age. The first phase of our journey through the Ice Age is drawing to a close, but the story is far from over. We've seen how the world cooled and dried, how human populations crashed and were forced into refugia, how the desperate struggle for survival drove innovations in technology and cognition. We've seen the first glimmers of symbolic thought and cultural diversity. But this is just the beginning. As we move forward in time, we'll see how these scattered, desperate bands of humans not only survived but began to thrive, how they developed the full package of modern human behaviour, how they began the great expansions that would eventually take them to every corner of the globe. The ice still grips the world. The great sheets continue their slow advance and retreat in cycles lasting thousands of years. The human population remains tiny and fragmented, but something has changed. The humans who have survived the first phase of the Ice Age are not the same as those who entered it. They are smarter, more innovative, more cooperative. They have been tested by the most extreme conditions our species has ever faced, and they have not just survived but adapted. They have become something new, something that had never existed before in the history of life on Earth. They have become modern humans, though they don't know it yet. As we prepare to continue our journey, to see how these early modern humans developed art and religion, how they began to spread across the world, how they eventually emerged from the Ice Age to create the civilizations we know today. Let's pause for a moment to appreciate the magnitude of what we've witnessed. In the span of perhaps 50,000 years, a geological eye blink, our species went through a transformation as profound as any in our evolutionary history. We were shaped not by the comfortable abundance of a tropical paradise, but by the harsh reality of a world locked in ice. Every aspect of what makes us human, from our intelligence to our creativity to our social nature, was forged in this frozen crucible. The story of the Ice Age is not just a story of climate and geology and evolution. It's a story of resilience and innovation, and the incredible capacity of life to adapt to even the most extreme conditions. It's a story that should give us hope as we face our own challenges, our own changing climate, our own uncertain future. If our ancestors could survive and even thrive in a world far more hostile than anything we know today, surely we, their descendants, carrying their legacy of intelligence and adaptability, can face whatever comes next. But that's a story for another time. For now, as you drift towards sleep, imagine those ancient humans huddled around their fires, the ice glittering in the darkness beyond the circle of light, telling stories to keep the fear at bay, passing on the knowledge that would ensure survival, dreaming of a warmer world they would never see, but that their descendants, including you, would inherit. They are so distant in time, yet so close in spirit. They are strangers, yet family. They are gone, yet they live on in every cell of your body, every thought in your mind, every word of the language you speak. Part 2. The Thaw and the Dawn of Us. The Ice Age had been humanity's greatest trial, but within that trial something extraordinary was happening. Deep in the refugia, in those precious pockets of survivable land, the human mind was undergoing a revolution. This wasn't a sudden breakthrough, not a moment of divine inspiration, or a single genius having a world-changing idea. It was a slow, gradual process, built from countless small innovations, countless moments of creativity, countless problems solved by desperate people trying to survive another day. But these small changes were adding up to something profound. The human brain, already large by the standards of the animal kingdom, was being pushed to develop new capabilities, new ways of processing information, new ways of understanding the world. Consider what life demanded of these Ice Age humans. They had to remember vast amounts of information about their environment. Where did different plants grow at different times of year? Where did animals drink during droughts? Which stones made the best tools, and where could they be found? What were the signs that weather was about to change? This wasn't just rote memorization. It required understanding patterns, making connections, predicting future events based on past experience. It required what we would now call abstract thinking, the ability to manipulate mental models of the world, to imagine scenarios that hadn't happened yet, to plan for contingencies. They also had to navigate complex social relationships. In a small band where everyone depended on everyone else for survival, social dynamics were literally matters of life and death. Who could be trusted? Who was skilled at which tasks? How could conflicts be resolved without destroying the group's cohesion? How could knowledge be effectively transmitted to the next generation? These social challenges required what psychologists call theory of mind, the ability to understand that others have thoughts and feelings different from your own, to predict their behavior, to manipulate and influence them. It required empathy, diplomacy, leadership, teaching ability. It required all the social intelligence that makes us such remarkably cooperative creatures today. The archaeological evidence suggests that around 70,000 years ago something shifted. The pace of innovation accelerated. The complexity of tools increased dramatically. We start to see clear evidence of what archaeologists call behavioral modernity, the full package of behaviours that characterise our species today. This wasn't a biological change. The brains of humans from 70,000 years ago were anatomically identical to our own. What changed was how those brains were being used. What cultural software was running on the biological hardware? The Ice Age had pushed humans to develop new ways of thinking, and these new cognitive tools were being passed on and refined through cultural transmission. One of the most remarkable developments from this period is the evidence for what we might call cumulative culture. This is the ability not just to learn from others, but to improve upon what you've learned and pass on those improvements to the next generation. A young person would learn to make tools from their elders, but they wouldn't just copy exactly. They would experiment, refine, combine ideas from different sources. Over generations, this led to technologies that no single individual could have invented from scratch. A complex projectile weapon, for example, requires knowledge of aerodynamics, materials science, anatomy, animal behaviour. No one person discovered all of this. It was accumulated over generations, each adding their small improvement to the collective knowledge. This cumulative culture required sophisticated communication. While we can't know exactly when fully modern language evolved, it seems likely that the cognitive demands of the Ice Age played a crucial role. Language is more than just naming things. It's about conveying abstract concepts, describing things that aren't present, talking about the past and future, expressing hypotheticals and counterfactuals. It's about teaching complex procedures, negotiating social relationships, telling stories that encode important information. The humans who could communicate most effectively, who could share knowledge most efficiently, who could coordinate group activities most successfully, were the ones who survived and thrived. The development of language would have created a positive feedback loop with other cognitive abilities. Once you can talk about abstract concepts, you can think about them more easily. Once you can tell stories, you can use narrative to organize and remember information. Once you can discuss plans with others, you can undertake more complex cooperative ventures. Language wasn't just a tool for communication. It was a cognitive technology that enhanced every aspect of human intelligence. It allowed humans to pool their mental resources, to think collectively in ways that no individual brain could manage alone. We see indirect evidence of this linguistic and cognitive revolution in the archaeological record. Tool-making traditions become more standardized within regions but more varied between regions, suggesting that complex technical knowledge was being transmitted culturally with high fidelity. We see evidence of long-distance trade networks, which would have required not just language but potentially multilingualism, the ability to communicate across cultural boundaries. We see evidence of scheduling and planning, with groups returning to the same sites at specific times of year, suggesting sophisticated temporal cognition and communication about future events. But perhaps the most compelling evidence for the cognitive revolution of this period comes from the explosion of symbolic behaviour. Humans weren't just making tools, they were making meaning. The use of ochre for decoration becomes ubiquitous. We find not just utilitarian objects, but items that seem to have purely symbolic value. Beads made from ostrich eggshells, requiring hours of careful work to produce. Deliberately perforated shells transported hundreds of kilometers from the ocean. Objects that had no practical function, but must have carried social or spiritual significance. This symbolic behavior suggests minds capable of what anthropologists call metaphorical thinking. This is the ability to understand that one thing can represent another, that a bead can represent status, that a pattern can represent a clan, that a mark can represent an idea. This is the cognitive foundation of all human culture, from art to religion to writing to mathematics. Once humans could think symbolically, they could create shared meanings, shared identities, shared beliefs that bound groups together more strongly than kinship alone ever could. The social implications of this cognitive revolution were profound. Humans were no longer limited to cooperating with their immediate family or band. They could create larger communities based on shared symbols, shared stories, shared beliefs. They could recognize distant strangers as part of their extended community through cultural markers. They could maintain relationships across time and distance through gift exchange and reciprocal obligations. They could create institutions, roles, and rules that organize society beyond the simple dominance hierarchies seen in other primates. This is when we start to see evidence of what we might recognize as religion or spiritual belief. The careful treatment of the dead becomes more elaborate and standardized. Bodies are buried with grave goods, suggesting belief in an afterlife. We find evidence of what might be shrines or sacred spaces, places where symbolic objects were deliberately deposited. While we can't know the specific beliefs of these ancient humans, it's clear that they were beginning to grapple with the big questions that still occupy us today. What happens when we die? What forces control the world? What is our place in the cosmos? These spiritual beliefs weren't just philosophical musings, they served practical functions in Ice Age society. Shared beliefs created group cohesion. Rituals marked important transitions and synchronized group activities. Stories encoded important survival information in memorable narratives. Taboos and rules regulated behavior in ways that promoted group survival. Religion was a social technology, as important as any stone tool, a way of organizing and motivating human cooperation on scales never before achieved. The cognitive revolution also enabled humans to become more effective hunters. This wasn't just about making better weapons, though the projectile technologies of this period are impressive. It was about understanding animal behavior at a deep level, predicting migration patterns, coordinating group hunting strategies, developing specialized roles within hunting parties. We see evidence of mass kill sites where entire herds were driven over cliffs or into traps, requiring sophisticated planning and coordination. We see evidence of seasonal hunting camps, suggesting that humans were scheduling their activities around the predictable movements of prey. But humans weren't just hunters. The cognitive revolution enabled them to exploit a wider range of resources than ever before. They developed techniques for processing toxic plants to make them edible. They learned to store food for lean times, using techniques like drying, smoking, and fermentation. They developed sophisticated knowledge of medicinal plants, using natural pharmacology to treat injuries and illnesses. They became ecosystem engineers, using fire to modify landscapes in ways that promoted useful plants and attracted game animals. This broad-spectrum resource use was crucial for surviving the unstable climate of the Ice Age. The glacial period wasn't uniformly cold. It was characterized by dramatic fluctuations, with relatively warm interstadials interrupting the cold stadials. These fluctuations could happen on timescales of centuries or even decades, far too fast for biological evolution to track. But cultural evolution could keep pace. Humans could adapt their strategies as conditions changed, switching from hunting to gathering, from terrestrial to marine resources, from mobile to sedentary lifestyles as circumstances demanded. The cognitive flexibility that enabled this adaptability is perhaps the defining characteristic of our species. Other animals are specialists, exquisitely adapted to particular ecological niches. Humans are generalists, able to survive in virtually any environment through cultural and technological adaptation. This flexibility was born from the instability of the Ice Age, from the need to constantly adjust to changing conditions. The humans who were most flexible, most innovative, most able to abandon old strategies and develop new ones, were the ones who survived. As we move forward in time, approaching 50,000 years ago, we see the full flowering of what we recognize as modern human behavior. The archaeological sites from this period are rich, with evidence of complex, sophisticated cultures. At sites like Border Cave and Sibudu Cave in South Africa, we find evidence of advanced technologies that wouldn't be out of place in much later periods. Bone tools carefully shaped for specific purposes, adhesives made from complex recipes requiring precise temperature control, bedding made from insect-repelling plants, suggesting knowledge of natural pesticides, snares and traps for catching small game, even what appears to be the earliest evidence of mathematics, notched bones that might represent counting or calendar systems. But it's in the realm of art that the cognitive revolution is most dramatically displayed. The cave art that begins to appear around 40,000 years ago is not primitive or childish. It's sophisticated, skilled, demonstrating not just technical ability but deep aesthetic sensibility. The artists who painted the caves of Europe and Indonesia weren't just depicting what they saw. They were using the natural contours of cave walls to give dimensionality to their figures. They were using perspective and shading. They were creating compositions that told stories or conveyed meaning beyond simple representation. Consider the famous cave paintings of Lascaux or Chauvet in France. These weren't casual doodles. They were major undertakings requiring significant resources and planning. The artists had to create pigments from minerals and charcoal, binding them with animal fats or plant resins. They had to create brushes from animal hair or plant fibers, or develop techniques for spraying paint through hollow bones. They had to work by firelight in deep caves, sometimes in chambers that required crawling through narrow passages to reach. The placement of the painting shows careful consideration of acoustics and lighting, suggesting these caves were performance spaces where art was combined with music and storytelling. The subjects of Ice Age art tell us something about the minds that created them. Yes, there are many depictions of animals, the horses and bison and mammoths that were so important for survival. But there are also abstract patterns, geometric designs that must have carried symbolic meaning. There are therianthropes, beings that combine human and animal characteristics, suggesting religious or mythological thinking. There are hand stencils created by blowing paint around hands placed against cave walls, a practice found across the world, suggesting a universal human impulse to say, I was here, I existed, I mattered. Perhaps most intriguingly, we find the Venus figurines, small sculptures of women with exaggerated sexual characteristics. These figurines, found from Europe to Siberia, date from around 30,000 years ago. They're often interpreted as fertility symbols or goddess figures, though we can't know their true meaning. What we can say is that they represent a shared artistic tradition across vast distances, suggesting cultural connections spanning thousands of kilometers. They show that Ice Age humans weren't just concerned with survival, they were creating art that dealt with themes of fertility, femininity, perhaps beauty, perhaps divinity. The music of the Ice Age is mostly lost to us, but we have tantalizing hints. Flutes made from bird bones and mammoth ivory have been found at several sites, some dating back over 40,000 years. These aren't simple whistles. They have carefully placed finger holes that allow for different notes, suggesting sophisticated understanding of acoustics and music theory. We can only imagine the songs that were played on these instruments, the voices that sang along, the dances that accompanied them. Music, like language, leaves no direct archaeological trace, but its presence is felt in the instruments left behind and in the universal human love of rhythm and melody that must have deep evolutionary roots. The cognitive revolution wasn't just about intelligence in the narrow sense of problem-solving ability. It was about the full range of human mental capabilities, imagination, creativity, aesthetic sense, humour, spirituality, the ability to find meaning and purpose even in the harshest conditions. These weren't luxury add-ons that developed after humans achieved material security. They were integral to survival in the Ice Age. The same minds that could imagine where herds would be next season could imagine spirits and gods. The same minds that could plan complex hunts could plan ceremonies and rituals. The same minds that could teach tool-making could tell stories that entertained and educated and inspired. This is perhaps the most profound legacy of the Ice Age. It didn't just shape our bodies and our basic survival instincts. It shaped our souls, if we can use that word. It gave us the capacity for transcendence, for finding beauty and meaning even in a harsh and dangerous world. The humans huddled in Ice Age caves, surrounded by darkness and cold and danger, didn't just survive. They created art and music and stories. They loved and laughed and wondered about the stars. They were fully human in every sense that matters, possessed of the same fears and hopes and dreams that move us today. As we approach 40,000 years ago, we see another remarkable development. Humans begin to expand out of Africa in significant numbers. This wasn't the first time humans had left Africa. There had been earlier expansions, including one around 100,000 years ago that reached the Middle East, but apparently went no further. But this expansion was different. These humans had the full cognitive toolkit of behavioral modernity. They had the flexibility and innovation to adapt to radically different environments. They had the social organization to maintain coherent groups across vast distances. They were ready to take on the world. The expansion was facilitated by the lower sea levels of the Ice Age. Land bridges connected regions now separated by water. Southeast Asia was connected to Indonesia. Australia was connected to New Guinea. The Bering Land Bridge connected Asia to North America. These weren't narrow strips of land but vast territories, hundreds of kilometers wide, supporting their own ecosystems. Humans could expand gradually, generation by generation, following game animals and familiar ecosystems into new territories. But the expansion also required remarkable innovation and courage. Consider the colonization of Australia, which occurred at least 50,000 years ago. This required crossing at least 90 kilometers of open ocean out of sight of land. It required boats capable of carrying families and supplies. It required navigation skills to find land that couldn't be seen from the departure point. It required the courage to set off into the unknown, possibly never to return. The humans who first reached Australia were undertaking one of the most daring ventures in human history, comparable to the Apollo missions in terms of the risks and unknowns involved. Once humans reached new territories, they had to adapt to radically different environments. The humans who entered Europe 45,000 years ago encountered a landscape dominated by ice and tundra, inhabited by cold-adapted animals like mammoths, woolly rhinoceros, and cave bears. They had to develop new hunting strategies, new clothing technologies, new shelter constructions. They had to learn to survive winters far harsher than anything in Africa. They had to compete with Neanderthals, who had been adapted to European conditions for hundreds of thousands of years. The encounter between modern humans and Neanderthals is one of the most fascinating episodes of the Ice Age. Neanderthals were not the brutish cavemen of popular imagination. They had large brains, made sophisticated tools, cared for their sick and elderly, and probably had language. They were well adapted to the cold European climate, with stocky bodies and physiological adaptations for conserving heat. For thousands of years, modern humans and Neanderthals coexisted in Europe, sometimes in the same regions. There's genetic evidence of interbreeding, with modern non-African humans carrying 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. Yet ultimately, Neanderthals went extinct around 40,000 years ago, while modern humans thrived. Why? The traditional explanation was that modern humans were simply smarter, but this seems unlikely given the Neanderthals' large brains and evident intelligence. A more likely explanation lies in the cognitive and cultural revolution we've been discussing. Modern humans had symbolic culture, art, and possibly more sophisticated language. They had larger social networks, evidenced by trade goods transported over vast distances. They had more diverse and flexible subsistence strategies. They had projectile weapons that allowed them to hunt more safely and efficiently. In the harsh conditions of the Ice Age, these small advantages added up to the difference between extinction and survival. The expansion of modern humans wasn't a triumphant march across empty lands. It was a desperate diaspora driven by the harsh conditions of the Ice Age. Human groups were pushed out of refugia by population pressure or resource depletion. They moved into marginal lands because the good lands were already occupied. They took incredible risks because staying put meant starvation. The colonization of the globe was humanity's response to the Ice Age crisis, a spreading of risk across multiple environments and continents. This global expansion had profound consequences for human evolution and diversity. As populations spread into different environments, they adapted to local conditions. Humans in northern latitudes developed lighter skin to better synthesize vitamin D in regions with less sunlight. Humans in Tibet developed adaptations for living at high altitude. Humans in the Arctic developed adaptations for processing high-fat diets. These biological adaptations were accompanied by even more dramatic cultural adaptations. Each population developed its own technologies, languages, beliefs, and ways of life suited to their particular environment. Yet despite this diversification, humans remained a single species, capable of interbreeding and sharing ideas across populations. The cognitive revolution had given humans a unique combination of biological unity and cultural diversity. All humans shared the same basic cognitive abilities, the same capacity for language and symbolic thought, the same fundamental emotions and social instincts. But each population expressed these universal human traits through their own unique cultural lens. This combination of unity and diversity would become one of humanity's greatest strengths, allowing for both cooperation and innovation on a global scale. As we move toward 30,000 years ago, we're approaching the last glacial maximum, the coldest and driest period of the entire Ice Age. Ice sheets reached their maximum extent, covering much of northern Europe and North America. Sea levels dropped to their lowest point, exposing vast areas of continental shelf. The tropical forests shrank to their smallest extent. Deserts expanded to cover much of the world's land surface. This was the Ice Age at its most extreme, and humans faced their greatest challenge yet. But by this time, humans were ready for the challenge. They had developed sophisticated cold weather technologies, tailored clothing made from animal skins, sewn with bone needles and sinew thread, provided insulation against the cold. Constructed shelters, some built from mammoth bones and tusks, provided protection from the elements. Control of fire had become so sophisticated that humans could maintain fires in the worst weather, could create different types of fires for different purposes, could even use fire to modify their tools and process their food. The material culture of this period is remarkable for its sophistication and beauty. The tools weren't just functional, they were elegant, sometimes decorated, clearly the products of skilled craftspeople who took pride in their work. We find ivory beads so small and delicate that they must have required specialized tools and incredible manual dexterity to produce. We find woven textiles, preserved by unusual circumstances, showing that humans had mastered yet another complex technology. We find evidence of specialized workshops, where particular crafts were practiced, suggesting the beginning of economic specialization. The social organization required to survive the last glacial maximum must have been incredibly complex. Hunting mammoth or other megafauna required coordinated groups working together with sophisticated strategies. Processing a mammoth provided enough meat to feed a band for weeks, but it required immediate and organized effort to butcher the carcass and preserve the meat before it spoiled. The distribution of resources within and between groups required systems of sharing and reciprocity. The maintenance of cultural knowledge required formal or informal educational systems. The management of group dynamics required leadership structures and conflict resolution mechanisms. We see evidence of this social complexity in the archaeological record. Sites from this period often show evidence of aggregation, times when multiple bands came together for communal activities. These gatherings might have served multiple purposes, exchanging resources and information, finding marriage partners, conducting rituals, reinforcing social bonds. Some sites show evidence of repeated use over thousands of years, suggesting they were traditional gathering places encoded in cultural memory and oral traditions. The spiritual life of last glacial maximum humans seems to have been rich and complex. The cave art reaches its peak during this period, with masterpieces like the paintings at Lascaux created around 17,000 years ago. But art wasn't confined to caves. We find decorated objects of all kinds, from tools to jewellery to what might be toys or gaming pieces. The amount of time and effort invested in non-utilitarian activities shows that even in the harshest conditions, humans weren't just surviving, but living, creating culture and meaning and beauty. The treatment of the dead becomes increasingly elaborate during this period. Bodies are buried with rich grave goods, including items that must have been valuable to the living. Some burials show evidence of complex rituals, with bodies arranged in specific positions, covered with ochre surrounded by symbolic objects. Child burials are particularly poignant, sometimes including toys or other items suggesting beliefs about the afterlife. These burial practices show not just respect for the dead, but complex beliefs about death, identity, and possibly an afterlife. One of the most intriguing developments of this period is the possible beginning of social inequality. Some burials are much richer than others, containing ivory beads, fox tooth pendants, and other valuable items that must have taken hundreds of hours to produce. Some individuals seem to have had special status, possibly as shamans, leaders, or skilled craftspeople. While Ice Age societies were still egalitarian by later standards, we see the first hints of the social differentiation that would eventually lead to complex hierarchical societies. The last Glacial Maximum also saw remarkable innovations in subsistence strategies. Humans weren't just following herds of large game, they were developing diverse economies that exploited a wide range of resources. They were fishing, using hooks and harpoons and possibly nets. They were trapping small game using snares and deadfalls. They were collecting and processing plant foods, including grass seeds that might represent the first steps toward agriculture. They were developing food storage techniques that allowed them to survive seasonal shortages. This economic diversification made human societies more resilient, better able to survive the failure of any single resource. As we approach 20,000 years ago, something remarkable begins to happen. The Ice Age, which had gripped the world for so long, begins to loosen its hold. The change is slow at first, barely perceptible, but it's the beginning of the end of the glacial period. The Earth's orbit is shifting again, the cosmic cycles turning toward warmth. The great ice sheets begin their long retreat. The world that had been locked in ice for 100,000 years is beginning to thaw, and the humans who had been shaped by the ice, tempered by its challenges, refined by its pressures, are about to inherit a new world. But the transition from Ice Age to interglacial wasn't smooth or simple. The climate became increasingly unstable, with dramatic fluctuations between warm and cold periods. The oldest dries, a cold snap around 18,000 years ago, was followed by the Bølling-Allerød warming, then the younger dries cooling, before the final warming of the Holocene. These fluctuations happened on timescales of centuries or even decades, fast enough that a single human lifetime might experience dramatic climate change. The megafauna that had dominated the Ice Age began to go extinct, victims of climate change, human hunting, or most likely a combination of both. For humans, these changes presented both opportunities and challenges. New lands were opening up as the ice retreated, but familiar resources were disappearing. Sea levels were rising, drowning coastal plains that had been home to human populations for millennia. The predictable movements of herds were disrupted as ecosystems shifted. Traditional hunting grounds became forests or wetlands. The strategies that had worked for thousands of years suddenly no longer applied. Once again, human adaptability was put to the test. The human response to these changes was remarkable. Rather than simply trying to maintain old ways of life in a changing world, humans innovated. They developed new technologies appropriate to the new conditions. The bow and arrow, which appears in the archaeological record around 20,000 years ago, allowed for more efficient hunting of the smaller, faster animals that were replacing the megafauna. Pottery, which appears around the same time in East Asia, allowed for new ways of cooking and storing food. Groundstone tools allowed for more efficient processing of plant foods. But the most profound change was in how humans related to their environment. During the Ice Age, humans had been nomadic hunter-gatherers, following resources across the landscape. But as the climate warmed and stabilized, some groups began to settle down. They found places where resources were abundant year-round, where they could build permanent structures and develop deeper relationships with particular landscapes. This sedentism was the first step toward agriculture and civilization, though those developments were still thousands of years in the future. The cognitive tools developed during the Ice Age made this transition possible. The same intelligence that had allowed humans to track herds and predict seasonal changes could be applied to understanding plant life cycles and soil conditions. The same social organization that had enabled mammoth hunts could be applied to communal construction projects. The same symbolic thinking that had created art and religion could be applied to concepts of property and territory. The Ice Age had given humans the cognitive and cultural toolkit they would need to create civilization. As we reach 15,000 years ago, the world is transforming rapidly. The Sahara, which had been even more extreme desert than today, begins to green as monsoons return. Lakes fill basins that had been dry for millennia. Rivers flow through valleys that had been dust. Forests expand from their refugia, recolonizing lands that had been tundra or steppe. The world is becoming more hospitable to human life, more abundant, more diverse. The harsh simplicity of the Ice Age is giving way to the complex ecosystems of the interglacial. Human populations, which had been suppressed for so long by the harsh conditions, begin to grow. Archaeological sites become more numerous and richer in artifacts. We see evidence of larger groups, more permanent settlements, more complex social organizations. Trade networks expand, carrying not just objects, but ideas across continents. Regional cultures become more distinct, developing their own traditions and innovations. The cultural diversity that characterizes our species today has its roots in this period of population growth and expansion. The art of this period shows a shift in human consciousness. While Ice Age art had focused on animals and abstract symbols, the art of the warming period increasingly depicts humans. We see scenes of dancing, hunting, perhaps warfare. We see what might be mythological narratives or historical events. Humans are becoming more self-aware, more interested in their own story, more conscious of themselves as actors in the world rather than just survivors in it. The external focus necessitated by survival in the Ice Age is giving way to a more introspective, self-reflective consciousness. This period also sees the development of what we might call proto-religious or proto-scientific thinking. Humans aren't just creating art, they're creating systematic representations of the world. We find what appear to be maps, astronomical observations, calendars. The famous cave paintings at Lascaux might encode information about stellar constellations. Notched bones might record lunar cycles. Humans are beginning to search for patterns and regularities in nature to create predictive models of the world. This is the beginning of both religious cosmology and scientific thinking, two ways of understanding the world that would shape human culture for millennia to come. The relationship between humans and animals is also changing. During the Ice Age, the relationship had been simple, predator and prey. But as humans settle down and certain animals become rarer, we see the beginnings of different relationships. The dog, domesticated from wolves perhaps 15,000 years ago, represents a profound shift in how humans relate to other species. No longer just prey or competitor, the dog becomes companion, helper, almost family. This domestication is a two-way process, with both species adapting to each other. It's the beginning of the human transformation of the biosphere that would eventually see us domesticate dozens of species and reshape entire ecosystems. As we approach 10,000 years ago, we're reaching the end of the Ice Age proper. The Younger Dryas, a final cold snap that lasted about 1,000 years, has ended. The climate has stabilised into the warm, relatively stable pattern of the Holocene, the geological epoch in which we still live. The ice sheets have retreated to roughly their modern positions. Sea levels have risen to near modern levels. The major features of modern geography, the coastlines and rivers and forests we know today, are largely in place. The stage is set for the next act in human history. But before we leave the Ice Age entirely, it's worth pausing to consider what has been accomplished. Over the course of 100,000 years, humans have been transformed from a relatively minor African primate into a global species capable of adapting to any environment. We've developed language, art, religion, complex social organization, sophisticated technology. We've survived near extinction and spread to every continent except Antarctica. We've laid the cognitive and cultural foundations for everything that would come next: agriculture, cities, writing, science, all of human civilization. This transformation wasn't planned or directed. It was an emergent response to the challenges of survival in a harsh and changing world. Each innovation, each adaptation, each small step forward was just an attempt to solve immediate problems, to survive another day, another generation. But collectively, these small steps added up to one of the most remarkable transformations in the history of life on Earth. The Ice Age didn't just test humanity, it created humanity as we know it. The humans who emerged from the Ice Age were not the same as those who had entered it. They were us. Every aspect of human nature that we recognize today, from our intelligence to our creativity to our social instincts, was shaped by the experiences of the Ice Age. When we cooperate with strangers, we're using social instincts developed for survival in small bands. When we tell stories or create art, we're exercising cognitive abilities that evolved for transmitting survival information and creating group cohesion. When we innovate and adapt, we're using the flexibility that allowed our ancestors to survive in a constantly changing world. Even our problems and pathologies have Ice Age roots. Our tendency to form in-groups and out-groups, which causes so much conflict in the modern world, evolved for survival in a world where encountering strangers could be dangerous. Our craving for sugar and fat, which leads to health problems in the modern world, evolved in a world where such nutrients were rare and valuable. Our fear responses, which can seem irrational in the safe modern world, evolved in a world full of real dangers. We are Ice Age, humans living in a post-Ice Age world, and many of our struggles come from this mismatch. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Ice Age is our resilience. Our ancestors survived conditions that would seem impossible to us today. They endured not just cold and hunger, but the psychological challenges of living in a harsh, dangerous world. They watched loved ones die, faced predators and natural disasters, struggled with the same fears and doubts that plague us today. Yet they persevered. They not only survived, but found meaning and beauty in their lives. They created art and music and stories. They loved and laughed and hoped. They passed on not just their genes, but their courage and determination to us. As you drift towards sleep, carried by this story of our ancient past, remember that you carry within you the legacy of those Ice Age survivors. In your DNA is the record of their journey. In your mind are the cognitive tools they developed. In your dreams tonight, you might walk the ancient landscapes they knew, feel the cold wind they felt, see the stars they saw. You're connected to them across the vast gulf of time, part of an unbroken chain stretching back through the millennia. Their struggles were not in vain. They survived so that you could exist. Here, now, in this moment. The Ice Age is over, but its echoes remain. Every time you solve a problem, you're using intelligence honed by 100,000 years of challenges. Every time you cooperate with others, you're drawing on social instinct forged in the crucible of survival. Every time you create something beautiful or meaningful, you're expressing the same drive that led our ancestors to paint cave walls by firelight. The Ice Age made us who we are, and understanding this deep history helps us understand ourselves.